Welcome to the Carousel of Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Allie Wagner. On last week's episode, you met carousel operator Bert Rashbaum. Bert is one of only a handful of people who have the distinct privilege of operating the carousel. In addition, he is a multi-hyphenate artist who spent his entire life soaking up the details of his life and processing them through his work. You heard about his creative process, why he loves the carousel, and how a personal tragedy forced him to be transformed by the carousel, just like its visitors. On today's episode, we'll continue the conversation about the creative process by focusing on the muse. How do muses inspire creativity? Who was Scott's muse? On today's episode, I'll introduce you to the Twirling Girl and the other hitchhikers, animals who have hitched a ride on the carousel in the wooden sweeps and the metal supports above. Let us begin with today's story. My husband Garth and I went to AccuDetox last night at the carousel. And when we arrived, Rebecca asked me about this week's podcast episode. I told her I didn't know anything about it. She asked me, "So you're not recording an episode?" "Oh, I am. I just don't know what it's about yet." Garth was standing nearby, looking at the top of the carousel, and he said to me, "You should do an episode about the animals up there in the rafters." "You mean the hitchhikers?" I asked. "Yeah, the hitchhikers." That's the name Scott came up with to describe the non-riding animals on the carousel who are just hanging out among the sweeps and the metal supports above. You know, just along for the ride. Rebecca put our acupuncture needles in, and we walked around the carousel, exploring the animals, checking them out. That's the coolest thing about going to AccuDetox on Monday nights, by the way. The carousel is closed, and you've got this unique opportunity to experience the animals up close without being rushed. So Garth and I went around noticing little details about this animal and that one. Have you noticed the ostrich lately? She has long, beautiful lashes, courtesy of carousel operator, front desk admin, and resident butterfly, Amy Hazelwood. Have you ever noticed the mouse who rides on the back of the rabbit? Chances are you might have missed it. So we're exploring the animals and noticing details, and we chat with Rebecca for a little bit, and then it's time to go home. Later at dinner, I asked Garth why he thought I should do a podcast episode on the hitchhikers. He looked at me and he shrugged. He said, "They told me so." Back in 1999, before the Carousel House was even built, before there was even a frame for it, Scott Harrison was diligently carving animals. One by one, night by night, in his shop, alone, after work, after the kids went to bed, after his wife went to bed, Scott diligently carved animals. He carved them because it felt good. He carved them because he knew how. Because even though he couldn't see how his carousel would come together, he knew if he took it step by step, one at a time, he'd get there, wherever it was he was going. And one day, Scott saw a picture on the cover of the Daily Camera newspaper that caught his eye. It was a picture of a girl, around 4 years old, dancing at a festival that had just happened that weekend. The little girl's arms sweep out in front of her, her legs are braced, and she's suspended mid-twirl in a moment of infinite bliss. When Scott saw the expression on the girl's face, when he saw the exuberance of her circular dance, he knew that energy of this girl in this moment was the kind of energy his future carousel needed to radiate. It was in that moment when he saw that image that he knew Scott had found his muse. Scott clipped out the photo in the newspaper and hung it by his desk. It was a reminder of the direction he should keep. It was a reminder of the true nature of his project. In Greek and Roman mythology, the Muses were 9 daughters of Zeus and the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne. They lived on Mount Helicon, and they devoted themselves entirely to the arts and sciences. Each of the daughters was responsible for a particular discipline, like poetry or music. And they were all responsible for turning mortals into vessels of divine inspiration. Not only did the Muses inspire mortals with brilliant ideas about music or dance, but they also actively were involved in guiding and assisting human beings in their creative pursuits. According to Greek and Roman mythology, the Muses provided artists with a creative spark, and the artists in turn honored and celebrated the goddesses in their work. But I didn't know any of this before this morning, before I sat at my desk and started working on this episode. The only idea I had was Garth's suggestion: do an episode about the hitchhikers. And since I didn't have any better ideas, I pulled out a copy of Scott's new book, Carousel Soul, and I flipped to the hitchhiker section. In this book, by the way, Scott goes through the details of how he carved each and every animal on the carousel. He explains what drew him to the animal, what he discovered about the animal along the way, and how he sees that animal fitting into the carousel as a whole. So when Garth told me that the hitchhikers wanted an episode about them, that book was the first place I looked. In addition to the twirling girl who sits at the top of the carousel, there are 9 other groupings of creatures. 3 cherubs, the swan, frog, and girl known as the transformational series, raccoon and skunk, the 2 orangutans, the fox, koala bear, the macaw, the bees, and the sloth and 2 butterflies. And I was 3 sentences into reading Scott's book about the twirling girls when I read the following sentence. In Greek and Roman mythology, the Muses were 9 goddesses who symbolized the arts and sciences. 9 Muses, 9 hitchhikers. Coincidence? I don't think so. In 2004, 5 years after seeing the twirling girl's photo in the newspaper, 5 years after using her image as the inspiration for how to build his carousel, Scott decided to carve his muse and place her 20 feet in the air on the top of the carousel center pole. He carved her in the same pose she held in the newspaper clipping, with her knees bent and her arms spread wide, and when he put her on top of the carousel, Scott noticed something. To his surprise and his delight, the twirling girl's original pose was the perfect one for the carousel. It looks exactly like she was intended to be there all along, orchestrating the joy below from her place in the heavens. In July 2008, construction on the Carousel house was set to break ground, and Scott wanted to find his muse and invite her to the ceremony. After 6 months of searching, he found her. Her name was Eliana Dreyfus, and at the time she was living in Switzerland. She was then 12 years old. Before arriving at the groundbreaking ceremony, Eliana had the opportunity to look at Scott's carving of her. The muse had only one comment for the artist: "Make my smile bigger." Just below the twirling girl, you'll find the 3 cherubs. Cherubs, which are present in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic literature, are celestial winged beings who serve as throne bearers of a deity. Traditionally, they're considered protective creatures of the heavens who guard places of interest, like the Garden of Eden. In our case, the 3 cherubs safeguard the carousel machinery and make sure everything runs properly. They also coincidentally hide a very ugly 2x4 that's up there that was really bugging Scott. He's pretty sure he was the only one who could see it, but he's happy to have the cherubs up there hiding it as well. You can see the cherubs best from the overlook window upstairs in the puppet theater. Scott insists that while they do look like they are goofing off, they take their job very, very seriously. Also viewed best from the puppet theater, on the outside of the rounding boards, you'll see what's called the transformational series. As the carousel spins round and round, you'll watch a girl rise from an egg that then becomes a swan, which transforms into a frog. The series was inspired by a photo essay called The Family of Man, which celebrates the universal aspects of the human experience. For Scott, the egg represents birth and rebirth. And the swan and the frog were specifically chosen because these animals often represented transformational figures in children's stories. Plus, it's another thing to look at while the carousel moves round and round and round. Clinging to a wooden sweep up above, also clinging to a bouquet of flowers, you'll find a raccoon trying to woo a skunk with some flowers. Why? Because why not? And then nearby, holding on to one of the metal support poles, you'll see a baby orangutan. Scott claims not to remember carving it. Apparently, it just showed up in his shop one morning, grasping tight to one of the brass poles he had stored there. According to Scott, the orangutan was afraid he'd be left out of this whole carousel thing. So Scott decided to keep it and just assume he carved it. There's also another adolescent orangutan sitting on top of the story catcher booth. She's holding a couple marbles and hoping someone will wave to her. On the wooden sweep next to the orangutan, you'll see a fox. Local cartoonist, carousel collaborator, and Scott's former neighbor, George Blevins, at one time befriended a local fox who he was able to feed directly out of his hand. When Scott finished the carving of his fox, he thought it might be interesting to test his carving on George's fox friend. Did Scott's fox look like a fox to an actual fox? One morning, when Scott's fox was complete, the 2 men set it on George's driveway with a couple of pieces of dog food in front of it. Then they went and hid in Scott's truck and waited to see if the real fox would appear. As it would happen, the real fox did not show up that morning, but a raven did. It noticed the pieces of the dog food in front of the carved fox and started hopping around. It wanted the food, but was afraid of Scott's fox. Scott and George watched it for a few minutes as it eventually gathered up enough courage to swoop in and pick up a bite or 2 of food in front of Scott's fox. But the raven then dropped the food out of fear of the fox it feared was behind him that had not moved. The bird later flew away, and Scott installed his fox on the wooden sweep next to the orangutan that very same morning. Closer to the center, right next to the gong, you'll see on a diagonal wooden timber that supports the center pole, you'll see a koala. Several years ago, a good friend of Scott's, a PTSD therapist who managed meetings of a group of veterans, including Scott, suffered the tragic loss of her first daughter. Scott asked if he could acknowledge her with an animal carving at the carousel. They agreed on a koala bear and placed the remains of her stillborn daughter inside the carving. They held a private ceremony and installed the koala a year later. Each year, Scott's friend, with her 2 children in tow, visits the carousel, and says hi to her daughter Elise on her birthday. After the death of their beloved pet macaw, longtime friends of the carousel, Susan and Wes Schneider, suggested to Scott that a full-size macaw be added to the carousel. Scott could not disagree, so now, perched over the riders, you'll see a macaw swinging above. Have you noticed the bees at the carousel? Yes, attached to one of the wooden sweeps, we have a hive of bees. Spiritually, bees are linked with rejuvenation, divinity, and the mysteries of the natural world. They're viewed as divine messengers who navigate between physical and spiritual realms. So, of course, we needed some bees. Our bees are made out of basswood, just like the other animals, but their wings are made of mica, a gemstone that's believed to help people reflect on their individual qualities. Mica helps us recognize our flaws without self-condemnation so that we may improve ourselves. And then there's the three-toed sloth and her two butterfly friends. Scott decided to carve the three-toed sloth in the wooden sweeps after watching a documentary about sloths on TV. He liked this sloth's Mona Lisa smile. He thinks she's telling everyone to slow down just a bit. Because of the pose he chose to put her in, however, the sloth was carved in 3 pieces and installed directly into the sweep. So Scott finished carving and painting her while up on a ladder on the days that the carousel was closed. But then he decided she was lonely and needed some friends. So Scott asked his friend, Robert Bellows from the Warrior Storyfield, to make him 2 butterflies. Listeners of the podcast will remember Robert from episode 13. So now the sloth and her butterfly friends enjoy each other's company. And no one is in a rush to go anywhere. Human beings have been fascinated by the creative process since it existed. Where do good ideas come from, and how can we be in the vicinity of them when they arrive? Artists, musicians, and creatives have found a multitude of ways to be ready for the muse when she strikes. Some meditate, others exercise. Bert cleans his fish tank, remember? Some insist on using lucky pens, others circle their desk counterclockwise before sitting down. Jack Kerouac would apparently touch the ground 9 times before he sat down to write. And I went to AccuDetox, knowing it would calm my nervous system and make it easier for me to hear her call. It turns out she was pretty direct in this week's case. Our lives are filled with messages. They are filled with signs. They are filled with synchronicities, begging us, please come this way, please make this thing. And many times we overlook them. We discount the ideas as silly or impractical, but what would happen if we followed them? What would happen if we answered the call and said, yes, yes, I will make a carousel. Yes, I will make a podcast. And what if we said yes, knowing we're not doing it alone? Knowing there are beings high above watching over us, giving us inspiration. What if the ideas were never really ours to begin with, but they're ours to play with in this game called life? I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but I do know it's fun to say yes. Even if you don't know where you're going, even if you don't know how you'll get there. It's fun to believe that you're collaborating with something larger than yourself. It's exciting to believe that everything's a sign. So if you need some artistic inspiration this week, maybe circle your desk 9 times. Or go for a walk. Or perhaps come to the carousel and take a peek above at our 9 little muses and the twirling girl who orchestrates it all from above. In the meantime, take care, be well, And as we like to say at the Carousel of Happiness, don't delay joy. And we'll see you next time around.
Beginnings and endings are only pretendings. I'll see you next time around. I'll see